A normal auction in Charleston, South Carolina, on the 12th of August 1849, led to a deal that would change the course of American history. A terrified, silent 7-year-old boy holding something against his chest was sold for $3. $3, which is the cost of 2 bushels of rice. That child would change the United States forever, in ways that even the most powerful men of his time could never have imagined. During the Civil War, his influence would reach the highest levels of government, change how the whole country thought about its past, and bring to light truths that some of America's richest families had tried to hide for generations. But his name was intentionally removed from official records. Historians had to work for almost 100 years to figure out what really happened because his story was so buried. There is no doubt that this child changed America. The question is how a 7-year-old could have that kind of effect after being bought for $3. Before we go on with the story of the slave child who changed U.S. history forever, please leave a comment and tell us what state you're from, if you're listening from the South or anywhere else in the USS. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about this time in American history. And now, let me take you back to that morning in August in Charleston, when everything started. Charleston was a city full of contradictions in 1849. The harbor was full of merchant ships with bright sails that carried cotton, rice, and indigo to far-off ports. The sails stood out against the humid southern sky. The Battery was lined with grand mansions, and their piazzas caught the sea breeze. Just a few blocks away, the slave markets ran as smoothly as any other business. The work of enslaved people was the only thing that kept the city going. But the white people talked about honor, heritage, and gentility, as if these good traits could exist without the system that made them rich. There was nothing special about the auction house on Charma Street. A 2-story brick building with barred windows and a courtyard where people were shown off like animals before being sold. Samuel Rutledge, the auctioneer, had been in charge of the business for 15 years. He took pride in keeping detailed records, not just of names and prices, but also of skills, physical traits, and any other traits that might affect value. He was very careful when he wrote in his ledgers. It was very hot that August morning, the kind of heat that made clothes stick to skin and made the air feel like soup. Rutledge had 12 people to sell, and their ages ranged from 14 to 45. Most of them were field hands from a plantation in the Low Country that was in debt. In his private notes, he called them standard merchandise. The child came separately, brought in by a trader named Harrison Vance, who worked the coastal routes between Savannah and Charleston. Vance was known for finding unusual cases, like people with special skills, people who could read, or people who had training and craft that made them more valuable. But this kid was different. It looked like Vance wanted to get rid of him. Vance told Rutledge, wiping sweat from his forehead, found him in Savannah. The Portuguese ship captain had him. He said the boy's mother died on board. Fever took her 3 days to get to wherever they came from. The captain was going to throw the child overboard, but someone paid him to bring the boy to shore. I don't know who, and I don't care. I just want him sold and gone. End quote. This very plated, end quote. The child stood quietly in the corner of Rutledge's office, watching. His skin was darker than that of most of the enslaved people who came through Charleston, which meant he probably came from a place far away from the American South. He was small for his age, thin because he didn't eat enough, and his eyes seemed to take in everything without giving anything away. He wore clothes that were too big for him, clearly hand-me-downs from an adult. He held a small leather journal against his chest like it was the only thing keeping him on earth. "What's up with the book?" Rutledge asked. "I don't know. I won't let go of it. There's some kind of foreign writing inside. I showed it to a merchant who knows languages, and he said it might be Arabic, but he wasn't sure. It could be worth a lot if you find the right buyer, or it could be worth nothing. Either way, the boy won't say a word. I haven't heard him say anything since Savannah." Rutledge took a closer look at the child. The silence was strange, but not unheard of. Trauma could take away a child's voice. The journal was interesting, though. It was against the law for slaves to read or write, so books were dangerous for them. But this child held the journal in a way that showed it meant a lot to him. Rutledge asked, "How much are you asking?" "Whatever you can get. Just give me $5 now and we'll call it even," He's more trouble than he's worth to me. Rutledge said yes. If the right buyer came along, someone rich who wanted an exotic servant or a scholar who was interested in the foreign writing, $5 was nothing. He wrote down very little about the child in his ledger. Male child. About 7 years old. Origin unknown, mute. Arrived with personal effects including one journal. At 10:00 the morning, the auction started. Plantation owners, overseers, and merchants, looking for domestic help, all filled the courtyard. The sales went on in a grimly efficient way. By noon, 11 people had bought something. The kid was last. Rutledge didn't think there would be much interest. The boy was too young to do hard work. People who are practical might think that his silence and foreign look are flaws, and they might also think it was strange that he was so attached to the journal. But when the child was brought forward, something unexpected happened. A man from the back of the crowd stepped forward. Rutledge had never seen him before. He was tall and wore dark clothes even though it was hot. His face looked like it was made of stone. When he spoke, his accent was clearly northern, maybe from Massachusetts or Connecticut. In 1849, it was rare for northern buyers to come to Charleston, and people were often suspicious of them. The man said, "I'll give you $3 for the child," and his voice carried across the courtyard in an unnatural way. $3? That was a very low amount. Rutledge was about to say no when the stranger said, "I'll take the journal with him." Rutledge stopped for a moment because of the way he said it. This man knew about the journal, and he wanted it even more than that. The child came second. "The journal is worth more than $3 by itself," Rutledge said, sensing an opening. "The journal is useless to you because you can't read it," the stranger said. "I'm being nice and giving you both for $3. Rutledge thought about it. He had put $12 into the child, which included what he had paid Vance and the cost of feeding and housing the child for a week. A loss of $3. But there was something about this stranger that made him want to finish the deal right away. The man's eyes were intense, which made Rutledge uneasy. He felt that saying no could lead to problems he didn't want to deal with. "Done," Rutledge said, and the deal was written down. The stranger paid with silver coins, took the child's hand, and left without saying who he was. Rutledge saw them walk away into the busy streets of Charleston. Even though it was very hot, he felt a chill down his spine. He had done thousands of sales in his career, but this one felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. He went home to his nice house on Trade Street that night, poured himself a big drink of whiskey, and tried to forget about the child's watchful eyes. He didn't write down the name of the buyer in his ledger. Later, when investigators asked why, Rutledge would say he had just forgotten, which was unusual for a man who was known for keeping detailed records. He would never say it out loud, but the truth was that even hours after the sale, he couldn't remember the stranger's face clearly. It was like the man's face wouldn't stay in memory. That same afternoon, the child and the stranger left Charleston on a coastal steamer going north. There is no passenger list from that trip, but the ship's log shows that it left on time. The steamer stopped in Wilmington, Norfolk, and Baltimore before going on to Philadelphia. At some point along that route, the child and the stranger got off. For more than 10 years, no one would know where the journey took place or what happened along the way. In September 1849, a child who looked like the boy showed up at a Quaker school in rural Pennsylvania near the town of Lancaster. Patient Hadley ran the school, which taught free black children and, secretly, escaped slaves who were using the Underground Railroad to get to freedom. Patience didn't keep any official records because that would have put everyone in danger. But she kept a lot of personal diaries that her family still has. Patience wrote in her diary on the 18th of September, 1849, "A man brought us a child and would not give his name. The boy does not speak, but his eyes show intelligence and deep sorrow. He carries a book written in strange letters that none of us can read. The man who brought him said only that the child must be taught to read and write English, and that the book should never be taken from him. He left $50 in gold for the child's care, which was far more than necessary, and left before I could ask questions. I have the unsettling feeling that we've become guardians of something far more significant than an orphaned child." The child stayed at school for 4 years. He learned to speak and write English very quickly during that time, but he never told anyone his name or where he was from. Because he always had a journal with him that he wouldn't let anyone read, the other students called him Book. Patience wrote about his progress in her diary. She wrote about how good he was at math, how he could remember long passages of text after reading them only once, and how he would wake up before dawn to practice writing by candlelight. But she also saw something that worried her. Every few months, a new stranger would show up at the school and ask about new students, especially those who had strange things with them. Patience always said she didn't know, but the pattern bothered her. There were a number of people looking for the child, and they were all working on their own. Patience made a choice in May 1853 that would change the course of the child's life. At the time, the child was about 11 years old. Dr. Edwin Hartwell, a traveling scholar who specialized in ancient languages and worked for a private library in Philadelphia, had come through Lancaster. Patience showed him the journal in the hopes that he could figure out what language it was written in and maybe help the child understand what his mother had left him. For 3 hours, Dr. Hartwell looked at the journal. His face had gone pale by the time he finally looked up. "Where did you get this?" he asked in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Why? Can you read it?" "It's one of my students," Hartwell said carefully. "I can read parts of it. It's written in Arabic, but it's an old-fashioned style, with symbols I've only seen in very old texts from North Africa." "Mrs. Hadley, this journal has information that many people would consider dangerous. Historical records of events that some powerful families would rather forget." "What kinds of things?" Hartwell shut the journal and gave it back to her. "Knowing less will keep you safer. But I can tell you this. The child who has this journal is in danger. If the wrong people find out what's written here, they'll do anything to get it. They'll kill for it." Patience felt like ice was running through her veins. "What should I do?" Hartwell said. "Show him how to be invisible. And for God's sake, tell him to never let anyone see that journal." Patience never saw Hartwell again after he left that day. But his warning turned out to be true. 3 men broke into the school in the middle of the night 2 weeks later. They tore the place apart, looking through every room and roughly questioning the kids about a boy with a foreign book. Patience and the older students chased them away with hunting rifles, but the message was clear. The child was no longer safe in Pennsylvania. Patience used her connections in the Underground Railroad to get the boy to travel north to New York State, where he would live with free black families near Albany. She gave him what money she could spare and a letter of introduction to the Thatcher family, who would take him in. The night before he left, she asked him something she'd never asked him before. "Child, do you know what that journal says?" The boy, who was no longer a child but not yet a teenager, looked at her with eyes that seemed much older than his years. He said in a low voice, "My mother told me." Patience had never heard him talk about his mother directly before. She said, "It's the truth about where we came from and where we were going." She said that powerful men stole our history and wrote lies to replace it. She said that this journal proves their lies, and that's why they want it destroyed. "What history?" The boy said, "Our history. African history. The history they don't want anyone to know because it shows that what they do to us, what they did to my mother, is built on theft and murder going back hundreds of years. The journal has names, places, transactions, proof." Patience could feel the weight of that knowledge on her shoulders. "And you've kept it safe all these years." "It's all I have of her," the boy said. "And what matters is the truth." He left the next day. Patience never saw him again, but she thought about what he said for the rest of her life. Years later, when she was an old woman watching the country tear itself apart in civil war, she would wonder if that child and his journal had somehow been involved in the great reckoning that came. She would think about it, but she would never know for sure. Marcus and Judith Thatcher took the boy in when he got to Albany in June 1853. They ran a cooperage, which was a workshop that made barrels for trade. Marcus was a black man who had bought his freedom 20 years before. Judith was born in New York and was free. They didn't have any kids of their own, so they took the boy in and didn't ask him any questions about his past. The boy, who finally picked a name for himself, Thomas Freeman, which means freedom and a new start, was helpful to the cooperage. He was good with his hands and had a good head for math. which let him figure out volumes and measurements faster than Marcus could with his usual methods. The company did well. Thomas never forgot Dr. Hartwell's warning or the men who had broken into Patience Hadley's school. He hid the journal in a waterproof oilskin pouch that was buried under the Cooper's floor. He didn't tell anyone, not even the Thatchers, who thought of him as a son. There was a lot of political activity in Albany in the 1850 seconds. The issue of slavery took over the country, and New York was split between people who wanted to end it and people who had business ties to the South. The city was home to the Underground Railroad, and both sides were always on the lookout for an edge. Thomas listened to the arguments in the streets and read the news whenever he could. He knew why the country was heading toward disaster and how it was going to happen. The system that his mother died in and that almost killed him was not going to last. It would either be taken apart or it would tear the country apart. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott case that black people could never be citizens. When he heard the news, Thomas was 14 years old. That night, for the first time in years, he read his mother's journal by candlelight. There were different parts to the journal, some of which were written by his mother and some of which were copied from older sources she had access to. The earliest entries were from the 1700s and showed how European traders and African merchants did business. These transactions had been systematically misrepresented in official records to make the slave trade seem more acceptable. Somehow, his mother got her hands on ledgers, letters, and bills of sale that showed how documents were changed on purpose to turn real prisoners of war and criminals into what were supposed to be permanent cattle. But there was more. In the back pages were the names of American families from Charleston, Richmond, Savannah, and New Orleans, who had made their fortunes in the slave trade and had gone to great lengths to hide some of the things they had done. His mother had written down the dates of specific crimes, such as murders that were made to look like accidents, forged documents that claimed ownership of free people, and plans to capture and sell free black children. Thomas figured out that his mother must have worked in a home where she could see private papers, maybe as a maid for a merchant or trader. For years, she'd secretly copied these records, which contained information that could ruin powerful families if it ever got out. People were looking for the journal for a good reason. It wasn't just a record of history. It was a weapon. That night, Thomas made a choice. He would wait. He would keep the journal safe until the time was right, when the country was ready to hear what it said. He was young, but he was patient. He could wait. The years went by. Thomas became a young man. The Thatchers' cooperage kept doing well, and Thomas became Marcus's full partner. He saved money carefully and made smart investments. By the time he was 17 inches, 1,860, he owned a small house. He learned to read and write English well enough to do complex accounting, and he taught himself math well enough to do it. People who knew him thought of him as a successful young craftsman and businessman. But Thomas was getting ready under that surface. He wrote letters to former students from Patience Hadley School who had moved to different parts of the North. He got in touch with journalists and people who wanted to end slavery. He carefully looked into the families mentioned in his mother's journal to make sure they were still around and still in charge. In April 1861, Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter, and the country went to war. Everything changed because of the Civil War. Young men in Albany joined Union regiments with great enthusiasm. The Coopers' business changed to making containers for military supplies, like barrels for food, water, and gunpowder. Thomas didn't have to serve in the military because his job was important to the war effort, but he watched friends and neighbors march south, many of whom never came back. During the chaos of war, information was worth money. Both sides needed to know about the enemy's leaders, resources, and weaknesses. The Union government set up networks of spies and informers all over the South. Confederate agents worked in northern cities to get information and mess up Union plans. A man came to Thomas's door in November 1862. He said his name was Colonel Isaac Brennan and that he worked for the War Department in Washington. Brennan wanted to know more about Southern families, their money, their business dealings, or anything else that might help him find Confederate supply networks or hidden assets. "I've heard that you might be able to get your hands on historical records about some Charleston families," Brennan said, keeping a close eye on Thomas's face. Records that could help the Union cause. Thomas's blood turned cold. How did this man find out about the journal? Did someone from his past say something? Or was it just bad luck? Or bad luck that the one secret he'd kept so well was found at the worst possible time? Thomas said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Brennan smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Mr. Freeman, I don't think you understand what's going on. We're at war, and the president has suspended habeas corpus. I could have you arrested and search your property without a warrant right now. But I'd rather we work together. The information you have could help us end this war faster and save thousands of lives." "Who told you about me?" "That's not important. What's important is that journal you've been hiding since you were 7, the one your mother died to protect." "Don't you think she'd want it to be used to bring down the system that killed her?" Thomas felt like he was stuck. What Brennan said was all true. His mother wanted the journal to be found, but the timing was important. It could do more harm than good if the journal was shown too soon or in the wrong way. The families mentioned in it were very powerful. They had ties to the military, the government, and the banking system. If you were careless enough to expose them, they would find ways to hide the evidence and kill anyone who was involved. "I need some time to think," Thomas said. Brennan said, "You don't have time, but I'll give you 3 days. After that, I'll come back with a warrant and soldiers." Brennan went away. Thomas stood in his empty house, feeling the weight of 15 years of secrets on his shoulders. He took the journal out of its hiding place that night and read it by lamplight at his kitchen table until dawn. His mother's small, careful handwriting filled the pages. Each entry showed how brave and determined she was to write down the truth, even though it was very dangerous. One part really hit him hard. "They think we are nothing. They think we have no history worth remembering and no records worth keeping. They think they can erase us from human memory. This journal is proof that they are wrong. Whoever reads this, my son, if you survive, or anyone else who finds it, use this knowledge wisely. Truth is a weapon, but weapons can hurt the person who uses them. Choose your moment carefully." His mother knew how powerful and dangerous the journal was. Thomas made up his mind. He would give Brennan the journal, but not the first one. Thomas worked day and night for the next 2 days to make a careful copy of the journal, writing down every entry in his own handwriting in a new ledger. He translated the Arabic parts into English so that American readers could understand them. He checked the names and dates against newspapers and public records when he could, and he added footnotes with proof. The end result was a document that could be verified, challenged, and debated on its own, without the mysterious original. It was not a religious text or an ancient artifact, but a historical record backed up by modern sources. Thomas gave Brennan the transcript and copies of the supporting documents he had put together when Brennan came back on the 3rd day. "Where's the original?" Brennan asked. "Safe," Thomas said. "That transcript has everything you need if you want the information. Names, dates, transactions, all documented and verifiable. Use it however you think is best for the Union cause." Brennan looked over the transcript very carefully. This could make some very important people look bad. Some of these families still have power in Washington. "Maybe that influence needs to be challenged," Thomas said quietly. Brennan stared at him for a long time before slowly nodding. "Maybe it does. Thank you, Mr. Freeman. You've done your country a service." He took the transcript and left. Thomas saw him walk away down the street and felt both relieved and scared. He had told his mother's secret, which had been a heavy weight on his mind since he was a child. But he had done it in his own way and on his own terms. The original journal was kept secret, so it would be safe for future generations if they needed it. People who could use the information inside it now had access to it. It was still unclear if they would use it wisely. Thomas didn't hear anything for 3 months. The war went on in a brutal way. There were battles all over Virginia and Tennessee, and the newspapers were full of lists of people who had died. It looked like the transcript he had given Brennan had gotten lost in the red tape of wartime Washington. In February 1863, things started to get weird. There was a fire in the warehouse next to Thomas's cooperage. It wasn't a big fire and was easy to put out, but it was strange that it happened when and where it did. An investigation pointed to arson, but no one was ever found to be responsible. A week later, Thomas saw that different men were following him at different times. They always kept their distance, but they were always there. When he confronted one of them, the man said he was a federal marshal looking into people who supported the Confederacy. The man disappeared into a crowd when Thomas asked to see his credentials. Thomas's letters to friends in other cities never got there. People who sent him letters got them opened, which means someone read them before they got to him. His business started to suffer when longtime customers suddenly canceled orders without giving a reason. Now, in his 60 seconds, Marcus Thatcher saw the changes and confronted Thomas. "Son, what have you gotten yourself into?" Thomas told him everything. The journal, the sale in Charleston, the years he spent hiding, and the transcript he gave to Colonel Brennan. Marcus listened without saying a word, and his weathered face grew more worried with each new piece of information. "You stirred up a hornet's nest," Marcus said when Thomas was done. "These powerful families you've written about aren't going to let themselves be exposed without a fight. War or no war. They have money, connections, and they're clearly trying to scare you. What do I need to do? Get out of Albany. Tonight if you can. Go somewhere they won't be able to find you easily. I have a cousin in Michigan who owns a lumber mill near Saginaw. No one would think to look for you there. You can work, stay safe, and wait for this storm to pass." At first, Thomas didn't want to. Running felt like giving up on the cause that had killed his mother. But Marcus was insistent, and Judith supported him. Thomas packed his things that night, including the original journal wrapped in oilskin and leather, and took the night train from Albany to Buffalo. He never saw the Thatchers again. 3 weeks after he left, a fire destroyed the cooperage and killed Marcus and hurt Judith badly. The official report said it was an accident. A lantern fell over in the workshop. But Thomas knew better. Because of him, because of what he had done, by giving that transcript to Brennan, they had been targeted. It was hard to bear the guilt. In the spring of 1863, Thomas worked in lumber camps in Michigan to get away from both his pursuers and his conscience. He sent Judith money for her medical care, but she died in June because her injuries never healed properly. Thomas thought he was to blame for both deaths, and the pressure of that responsibility almost killed him. But in July, something happened that changed everything. The Union won the Battle of Gettysburg, and all of a sudden, the war's momentum changed. More importantly, Thomas got a letter from an unlikely source that had been sent through several addresses to keep it secret. The letter was from a journalist named Harriet Weston, who wrote for a Boston newspaper that was against slavery. She had gotten parts of Thomas's transcript through ways she couldn't talk about, and she had checked many of the claims herself. She was writing a series of articles about the crimes that had been recorded in the transcript, but she needed Thomas's help to double-check some facts and, if possible, to see the original journal to make sure everything was correct. "The country is changing," Harriet wrote. "President Lincoln has issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The question of slavery is no longer political, it's moral. Your mother's documentation could help make sure that the truth about how this system was built can't be denied or forgotten when this war is over. Please get in touch with me. Let's finish what she started." Thomas read the letter 3 times. This was the chance he had been waiting for. A way to make sure that his mother's work would be recognized and that her sacrifice would mean something. But to say yes meant coming out of hiding and becoming a target again. He thought about Marcus and Judith, Patience Hadley, and his mother, whose name he didn't know and whose face he couldn't remember. They had all put everything on the line for freedom and truth. What else could he do? Thomas wrote back to Harriet Weston and said he would meet her. But he had to do one more thing before he could show himself. He went to Detroit and put the original journal in a bank vault with instructions that it should only be given to certain people. Harriet Weston, or if she wasn't available, to the offices of the abolitionist newspaper, or if that didn't work, to the Library of Congress. The journal would eventually be made public if he died or went missing. Even if he didn't, the truth would live on. It was only then that Thomas went to Boston to meet Harriet Weston and start turning his mother's papers into a weapon against the system that had kept them both in slavery. When Thomas's journey seemed almost too hard to handle alone, Harriet Weston turned out to be more than just a journalist looking for a story. If this story about one child's burden of carrying the truth through a country that is falling apart makes you feel something, tell someone who likes hidden histories about it. If you think some truths are worth any sacrifice, hit that like button. If you want to know how this unlikely partnership would finally bring those buried secrets to light, subscribe. Let's move on to what happened when these two strong-willed people worked together in the summer of 1863. In August 1863, Harriet Weston met Thomas Freeman in Boston. She was 42 years old at the time. She had been writing for newspapers that were against slavery since the 1842. She did this by interviewing escaped slaves and free black communities to show how slavery really was. She had her articles censored, her office broken into, and her life threatened. But she never stopped writing because she thought that words could change the world. When Thomas entered her office on Tremont Street, Harriet saw immediately what the boy purchased for $3 had become. A young man of 20, careful and watchful, carrying burdens far too heavy for someone his age. But she also saw determination and a quiet strength that reminded her of the best people she'd met while working for social change for decades. "Tell me everything," she said, and Thomas did it. It took hours to tell. Harriet didn't say a word while Thomas talked about the auction house, the silent years, the schools and safe houses, and the journal he had kept safe through it all. After he was done, she leaned back in her chair and looked at him closely. "Do you understand what you're offering me?" she asked. "This isn't just a story. This is proof that could ruin powerful families. It could make you a target for the rest of your life." "I've been a target since I was 7, Thomas said softly. "Now that I'm older, I can fight back." Harriet nodded slowly. "Then we'll fight together. But we have to do it right. We have to check every claim, every name, and every date. We can't let them say this is just a fantasy or a lie." For 3 months, they worked together, and it was hard work. Harriet knew people all over New England, like archivists, historians, and government clerks, who agreed with her anti-slavery views. She wrote to archives in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York, asking for copies of ship manifests, property deeds, and bills of sale from the early 1700s. Thomas worked with her to translate parts of the journal and check his mother's entries against the documents Harriet got. What came out was more detailed and more damaging than either of them had thought. The journal didn't just write down one crime at a time. It showed how crimes happened over and over again. The same families kept showing up over the years, their business ties getting stronger and their legal tricks working together. They had set up what was basically a conspiracy that lasted for generations. Each new generation got not only money, but also the skills and contacts they needed to keep up the lie that their system was real. One case took weeks of research. In 1731, a Charleston merchant named William Creswell bought a group of people who had survived a slave ship that had sunk in a storm. One of the survivors was a man named Kofi. He had papers that showed he was a merchant from the Gold Coast who was on business. Creswell didn't respect these papers. Instead, he had them destroyed and sold Kofi as a slave. When Kofi's business partners in London asked about the ship, Creswell said that it had sunk and that there were no survivors. Thomas's mother had written down this information in great detail, including copies of letters between Creswell and other merchants about how to deal with problems when educated Africans came with proof of their free status. The letters showed a clear plan: destroy the papers, separate the people, sell them quickly to inland plantations where they wouldn't be able to get to ports or get help from the law, and keep plausible deniability if anyone asked. Harriet found Creswell's descendants. The family was still around in 1863 and was now important in South Carolina politics and banking. One of William Creswell's great-great-grandsons was a Confederate officer. The money that paid for his schooling and job came directly from his ancestors' fraud. Harriet looked at the papers on her desk and said, "This is what we need. Not just crimes from the past, but also direct links between past fraud and current power. Show people that this isn't ancient history, it's the basis of their modern world." They had enough information for 5 articles by October. Edmund Pierce, Harriet's editor at the newspaper, read the first draft and turned pale. "Harriet, these are serious claims against families with a lot of power. Some of them have family members in Congress. Are you sure about your sources?" Harriet told him, "Every fact has been checked. Every name, every date, every transaction." Thomas's mother didn't write down rumors. She wrote down crimes she had direct proof of. And if they sue us, we'll show the proof in court. That might be the best outcome. A public place to show everything we've found. For a week, Pierce couldn't make up his mind about whether or not to publish. The first article came out on the 15th of October, 1863, and it was called Foundations of Fraud: How America's Slave System Was Built on Systematic Deception. The answer came right away and was violent. Harriet got letters threatening to burn down her house, attack her, and kill her within days. Someone threw a brick through her office window with a note that said, "Lies have consequences." 2 men tried to break into her apartment, but neighbors who heard her screams stopped them from doing worse. Thomas also had to deal with the same kind of harassment. Men were now openly following him and not trying to hide their spying. His landlady told him to leave because she was scared of the attention. He moved 3 times in 2 weeks, and each time he found a new place to live, but his pursuers always found him and kicked him out again. But the articles also had people who stood up for them. Throughout New England, abolitionist groups reprinted them. Ministers used them in their sermons. Frederick Douglass himself wrote back, praising the documentation and asking for more research into the historical crimes that were revealed. The argument got so bad that it made its way to Washington. In November, Harriet heard that a congressional committee wanted to look at the evidence. Some members of the committee really wanted to find out the truth about history, while others just wanted to discredit the articles and protect the families that were being accused. In December, Thomas got the summons. In January 1864, he was supposed to go in front of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War and bring any papers that he said backed up his claims. Thomas made a lot of plans. He brought the transcript, which now has a lot of notes and supporting documents on it. He brought copies of ship manifests, property deeds, and court records that Harriet had gathered, but he didn't bring the original journal. It was still in a bank vault in Detroit, where it was safe because of legal arrangements that would make it public if something happened to him. It took 2 days to get to Washington. Thomas went with Harriet and Edmund Pierce, who had agreed to go with them as a witness to the verification process they had done. They got there on the 10th of January, 1864, to a capital city that had been changed by war. The streets were full of soldiers, hospitals were full of injured men, and the air was thick with military urgency. The hearing took place in a room in the Capitol building that is used for committees. There were 13 congressmen and senators who were judging, and their faces showed a range of emotions, from sympathetic to openly hostile. There were journalists, abolitionists, and family members of the accused in the gallery, all waiting to see how the testimony would go. Thomas stood in front of them and told them his story. He talked for 2 hours about the Charleston auction, the journal his mother had kept safe, and the process he and Harriet had used to check things. He answered questions about certain entries, his mother's possible sources, and how a servant in the house could have gotten to the private papers of merchants and traders. "My mother worked in homes that did this kind of work," Thomas said. "She copied documents when she could for many years. She knew it was risky, but she did it anyway, because she thought the truth was more important than her safety." The most radical abolitionist on the committee, Pennsylvania Representative Thaddeus Stevens, wanted more information. "And you've kept this journal safe for 15 years through many moves and people looking for it?" "Yes, sir. It was all I had of her, and it was the truth she died to protect." Senator James Hargrove of Kentucky, a Democrat with family ties to Southern plantation owners, was not as understanding. "Mr. Freeman, you were 7 years old when you supposedly got this journal. How can we trust your memory of what happened then? How do we know you didn't make up this whole story, maybe with Miss Weston's help, to hurt good families during the war?" Thomas looked him in the eye. "Senator, I didn't make up the ship manifests in the Massachusetts archives, the property deeds in Charleston, or the court records in Rhode Island. All of those documents exist on their own, and were made decades before I was born. My mother's journal doesn't make these records. It explains how they are related to each other. It shows the pattern that individual documents don't show." Next, Harriet took the stand and went into great detail about how she verified things. She had copies of all the documents they had talked about, sorted by family and by date. She took the committee through specific cases, showing how the journal's claims were backed up by historical records. She said, The journal told us where to look. It gave us names and dates that helped us find proof in public archives. If Mr. Freeman had made this up, he would have needed access to archives in 6 states and the ability to understand how documents from different repositories connected to each other. That doesn't make sense for a man of his age and background. The only reasonable explanation is that the journal is real. For 3 days, the committee talked about it. Some members wanted to dismiss the claims right away, saying they were wartime propaganda meant to hurt the Confederacy. Some people knew how important the documents were to history and asked for more research. In the end, a deal was reached. A small group of historians, linguists, and document experts would be able to look at the original journal in a controlled setting. The committee would make a decision about its historical value if they could prove it was real. If they found proof that the story was made up, the case would be over and Thomas could be charged with fraud. Thomas said yes. In April 1864, he went to Detroit with 5 scholars, 2 members of Congress, and a stenographer to write down everything that happened. They met at the bank where the journal was kept, in a private room with guards outside to keep everyone safe. The test was very thorough. Dr. Philip Ashbury, a historian at Harvard, looked at the paper and ink and compared them to other documents from the early 1800s. Professor John Whitfield, an Arabic linguist, looked at the script and language to see if there were any mistakes or things that didn't make sense. Dr. Rebecca Chen, one of the few female scholars who was allowed to take part, looked at the handwriting and compared it to samples from the time that are known. They tested every part of the journal for 2 days. They looked at the binding, the way the pages had worn down, and how the ink had faded over time. They looked at entries in the journal and compared them to historical events that could be checked against other sources. They looked for any signs that the journal was made recently and then made to look older. On the 2nd day, in the evening, the scholars gave their initial results to the members of Congress. The group was represented by Dr. Ashbury. We have looked over this document as carefully as we can with the tools we have available. The paper is similar to the kinds of paper that were used in the 1,820 seconds and 1,830 seconds. The ink is similar to the kinds of ink that were used at that time. The Arabic script looks like writing styles from North Africa at that time. The wear and tear and aging are consistent with a document that has been handled carefully but repeatedly over the course of several decades. How about the content? One representative asked. Professor Whitfield said, the entries talk about events and documents that have only recently been found in archives. Information that the general public, and certainly not a 7-year-old child in 1849, would not have been able to get. We've confirmed the existence of some of the ships mentioned in the journal through port records that aren't widely available. The level of detail about trade practices, legal procedures, and family connections requires access to primary sources that Mr. Freeman couldn't have had as a child. Dr. Chen added her opinion. The handwriting changes in a way that suggests it was written over a long period of time. There are corrections, additions, and changes in ink that suggest it wasn't written all at once. This is a journal that someone with access to private information kept over time. Everything about this document suggests it is real. The members of Congress looked at one another. One of them, a man who had been openly doubtful of Thomas's claims, spoke softly. Are you saying that all of this is real? Dr. Ashbury said carefully, we're saying that this journal was written during the time it claims to represent by someone who had extraordinary access to information about the slave trade, and that its contents can be checked against other historical sources. Whether that makes it real in the sense of proving criminal conspiracy is a legal and historical judgment beyond our expertise. But as a historical document, yes, it's authentic. It took a week for the news to get to Washington. In May 1864, the committee released its findings. The journal was real, the documentation was reliable, and the historical claims were worth serious academic study. They didn't go so far as to ask for legal action, because too much time had passed and the war made it impossible. But they did say that the journal showed disturbing patterns of fraud and systematic violations of human rights in the creation of American slavery. The report from the scholars changed everything. What were once controversial claims became accepted historical facts. The families mentioned in the journal could no longer just deny the claims. They had to deal with proof, and the agreement of experts. Some families tried to distance themselves from what their ancestors did as a way to respond. They gave money to freedmen's schools and hospitals in public to show that they didn't agree with the sins of their ancestors. Some people got angry and denied it, saying that the morality of the present couldn't judge the standards of the past. Some families did things more directly. Thomas got a visitor at his Boston boarding house in June 1864. She was a well-dressed woman in her 52s who said she was Catherine Harrington Sutherland, the great-great-granddaughter of the merchant whose crimes were most fully documented in the journal. "Mr. Freeman," she said, her voice steady, "I'm sorry for what my ancestor did to yours." Thomas was speechless. He thought he would get threats, lawsuits, or bribes. This was not what he had planned. "Mrs. Sutherland went on, "I've read your testimony, Miss Weston's articles, and the family papers that were never meant to be seen by outsiders. Everything you've said about William Creswell is true. He ruined lives to make his money, and my family has benefited from his crimes for generations. I can't change what he did, but I can admit it and try to make things right." She put a piece of paper on the table between them.
"This is a legal document that gives away property that has been in my family since 1735. My ancestor bought it with money he made from trade.
"I'm giving it to be used for a school for freedmen. It's not enough. It can never be enough. But it's what I can do." Thomas looked at the paper and then at Mrs. Sutherland. "Why?" "Because the truth matters," she said without going into detail. "Because your mother was right to write down what she saw, and you were right to keep it. My children deserve to inherit something better than wealth built on lies and pain." Thomas never saw her again after she left. But what she did set things in motion. In the months that followed, 3 other families did the same things. They gave money, made public statements, and tried to make things right in small ways that could never fully make up for the huge injustice that had happened in the past. Thomas stayed in Boston until the end of the war, where he worked with Harriet on more research. They recorded more cases, found more family ties, and put together a more complete picture of how the system was built and kept up. Their work laid the groundwork for a new group of scholars who were looking into the legal and economic systems of American slavery. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April 1865, Thomas was 22 years old. He went to the celebration in Boston Common, where thousands of people stood and listened as speakers announced the end of slavery and the start of a new era. He thought about his mother, who had never lived to see this day, and Marcus and Judith, who had died protecting him, and Patience Hadley, who had given him the education that had made everything else possible. He knew that the work wasn't done. The war ended slavery as a legal system, but it didn't end the racial hierarchy that supported it. The families whose stories were in the journal were still rich and powerful. The ways of taking advantage of people would change, but the truth was now part of history and could be found by anyone who wanted to. That was important. Thomas went back to Michigan after the war. He married Sarah Jenkins, a school teacher he met through abolitionist groups, and they lived a quiet life in Saginaw. Thomas taught each of their 4 children about the grandmother they had never met, the woman who died to tell the truth. He never talked about the journal in public again. Sometimes journalists would look for him, hoping to get new information, but Thomas always said no. The journal said everything it needed to say. His mom's work spoke for itself. He didn't think it needed anything else. But he still wrote to historians and scholars who wanted to learn more about that time period in private. He told what he remembered, made things clearer, and helped researchers see how documented crimes had long-lasting effects. His ideas influenced many academic works that came out in the years after the war. When Thomas was 48 years old, he gave the Library of Congress the original journal in 1891, along with detailed instructions on how to keep it safe and make it available. He wanted it to be open to researchers, but safe from people who might still want to destroy it. The library agreed to his terms, and the journal is now in the manuscript division, where it has been ever since. Thomas died in 1912 at the age of 69. He lived long enough to see the promise of Reconstruction broken and Jim Crow laws create new ways to oppress people. His later letters show that he was upset that the truth he had helped bring to light hadn't changed the country as much as he had hoped, but he never said he was sorry for letting the journal out. Even when people chose to ignore it, the truth still mattered. Harriet Weston kept working as a journalist until her health got so bad that she had to retire in 1887. She wrote dozens of articles and 2 books that built on the research she had done with Thomas. She always gave him credit as a co-author and praised his mother's bravery. Thomas went to her funeral in Boston in 1889, along with hundreds of other people whose lives she had changed by always fighting for truth and justice. The person who bought Thomas in Charleston was still a mystery. Even after years of study, Thomas and later historians were never able to find him. Some people thought he was an underground abolitionist. Some people thought he might have been in a secret group that worked to keep dangerous information safe. Thomas thought that the man knew exactly what was in the journal and that a child would be the best person to keep such dangerous information safe. But he never knew for sure, and the mystery added to an already amazing story. Samuel Rutledge, the auctioneer, died in 1873. He had lost everything in the war. During the Union occupation, his auction house caught fire, and most of his records were lost. The one page in the ledger that recorded Thomas's sale survived only because Rutledge kept it separate. He may have sensed even then that this sale was different from the others. After the war, when police asked him about some sales, he showed them that page. He didn't know that he was writing down the beginning of a story that would help them figure out how he made money. The families whose stories were written in the journal had different fates. Some, like the Harringtons through Catherine Sutherland, admitted that their ancestors had done wrong and tried to make things right. Some people fought the claims until the end of their lives, spending huge amounts of money on lawyers and public relations campaigns that ultimately failed to change the historical record. A number of families just vanished from public life, their names disappearing from society records as they hid from view. In African American communities by the early 1900s, Thomas Freeman's story had become a kind of legend. The child who sold for $3 and helped bring to light the false foundations of slavery. But most people forgot about the full story until the civil rights movement of the 1960 seconds brought back interest in hidden histories. Researchers at Howard University found the journal again in the Library of Congress archives in 1968. They put out the first full translation, which made the text available to people who couldn't read Arabic. The publication led to new research into the economic and legal aspects of slavery, with Thomas's mother's records as a main source. The descendants of Thomas, who still live in Michigan, had mixed feelings about this new interest. They were proud of how brave their ancestors were, but they also knew that the work he had started was still not done. The systems he had exposed had changed, but they were still there. The truth he had helped protect was still needed, still important, and still pushing Americans to face their past honestly. The Library of Congress still has the journal, which is still readable even though its pages are fragile. Researchers can make appointments to look at it. Every few years, someone finds a new detail or connection in the entries, which makes the historical record a little more complete. What do you think about Thomas Freeman's journey and the sacrifice his mother made? Do you think there are still stories that haven't been told yet because powerful people want to keep them hidden? Please leave your thoughts in the comments section below. If this story touched you, tell someone who cares about little-known American histories about it. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to get more stories like this one about regular people who changed history in amazing ways. We appreciate you sticking with us through this whole journey. Remember that history isn't just what happened. It's also what we choose to remember and what we fight to keep alive until the next story. Keep asking questions, looking for the truth, and honoring those who came before us.